come all to a beautiful show. It's gonna be awesome and some other stuff. Dee-dee-dee-dee-doo-dee-dee-doo-dee-dee-doo-dee. Some other musical stuff.
Hello and welcome. This is special session for the week ending Friday, December 20th, 2024. I'm Brian Schott, managing editor of Utah Political Watch. This week on the show, Senator Mike Lee says Elon Musk or Vivek Ramaswamy should be the Speaker of the House of Representatives. Phil Lyman loses again. That guy has more L's than the planet Krypton. Looking like Jesus is proving to be a lucrative side hustle in Utah. My guest this week on the show is Jackson Lewis, who was just elected to a seat on the Canyon School Board. At 19 years old, he's believed to be the youngest elected official in Utah history. We have a delightful conversation about the importance of getting involved in the political process. I can't wait for you to hear that. Plus, it really seems like the Utah Legislature is afraid of my journalism. I'll explain why I am now the most feared journalist in the state of Utah. Remember to subscribe to the program wherever you get your podcasts. If you leave a rating and review, it will help more people find the show. And you can also sign up for my newsletter for free at utahpoliticalwatch.news. If you'd like to support my work covering Utah politics, making more podcasts like this possible, making more stories possible, you can become a paying subscriber there as well for as little as $5 a week. Now, let's get to this week's news. Senator Mike Lee wants either Elon Musk or Vivek Ramaswamy to become the next Speaker of the House of Representatives. On Wednesday, Republicans in Congress thought they had a spending deal done to keep the government funded through March. But Elon Musk decided he didn't like it, took to social media, started attacking the spending plan. Donald Trump then gets involved, and they scrapped the idea. Then on Thursday, Republicans show up with a very stripped-down version of a spending bill that Donald Trump endorses, but this thing fails on the floor of the House of Representatives. It doesn't get enough vote, goes down in flames. Mike Lee goes on Benny Johnson's podcast. Lee says that he thinks House Speaker Mike Johnson isn't up to the task. And when the new Congress gets underway in January, the Republicans there, who will have a majority, should elect either Elon Musk or Vivek Ramaswamy as the next Speaker of the House.
We're going to need new leadership. We've got new leadership in the Senate coming in the coming year. And I believe that the writing's on the wall, unless I'm just mistaken. It seems to me that new leadership in the House is almost inevitable. If that's the case, I think we need to go outside the box. I think we need to look to a different place. Remember, neither the Constitution nor the House rules require that the Speaker be a current member of the House of Representatives. Look, the Doge movement is enormously popular in the House. Just listen to House members who are Republicans. They can't get enough of them, including many of the people who have been part of this swampy process. They praise Doge. Oh, Doge is going to save this. If that's the case, that being the case, given that they all have expressed such affection for Vivek and for Elon, let them choose one of them. I don't care which one to be their speaker. That would revolutionize everything.
Shortly after he was elected, President-elect Donald Trump appointed Musk and Ramaswamy to lead a new Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, and that body has been tasked to advise the Trump administration on a large-scale structural reform of the federal government. I want to remind you that Musk and Ramaswamy were not elected by anyone to lead anything, but they're now in charge of making these broad recommendations. Now, you don't have to be a member of the House of Representatives to be the Speaker of the House. That's not in the Constitution, but they've never elected anyone who was not a member to become the Speaker. It's never happened before, and putting Musk in that position would present some problems because he would be third in line for the presidency. Musk is not a natural-born citizen. He's not eligible to become president, so that would create a very thorny constitutional situation if he were to be tapped for that role. Benny Johnson's name might ring a bell. He was previously part of a group called Tenet Media, and that organization, according to an indictment from the Justice Department, was allegedly part of a Russian funded influence operation leading up to the 2024 election. The indictment, which was unveiled in September, revealed that 2 employees of the Russian state-controlled media outlet allegedly funneled about $10 million into Tenet Media and push them to create content that was favorable to Donald Trump. Now, for his part, Johnson claimed that he was just a victim in all of this scheme. He didn't know where the money was coming from. Lee's connections to Johnson go back a couple of years. In the summer of 2022, Johnson was one of the people who encouraged Senator Lee to start his personal Based Mike Lee account on X/Twitter. And since then, Lee has posted on that account thousands of times a week, or should I say he shitposted on that account thousands of times a week. So we can all thank Benny Johnson for that. Utah's on track to add a seat to their congressional delegation in 2030. The new census numbers that were released this week showed Utah was in the top 10 in population growth for all states. They were the 10th largest growth. They were the 10th largest in real numbers. They added 36,498 people, and that was also good for the 9th largest percentage increase at 1.1%. If those trends continue, Utah is on track to add a seat to their House delegation in Congress. They would go from 4 to 5. They use the census numbers to divvy up how the 435 House seats are distributed across the country, and Utah would be on track to add a seat. If you remember, Utah came really close to adding a seat in 2020, but fell just short, and it looks like this population growth that the state is undergoing right now, if the trends continue, we'll be adding 1 seat in Congress in 2030. The projections show that 2 other western states would be adding a seat. Those would be Idaho and Arizona. Texas, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Tennessee would also gain seats. Other states have to lose those seats. And according to the projections from the Brennan Center, states that would be on track to lose seats would be California, New York, Illinois, Pennsylvania. California would lose 4 seats under the current trends, and that would mark just the second time that California has lost representation in Congress. Utah had only 1 seat in Congress when it was admitted to the Union in 1896. They gained another in 1910, and then they stayed at 2 seats for a few decades until 1980, when population growth gave them a 3rd seat after that reapportionment. And then Utah added their current 4th seat in 2010. That was after they narrowly missed out on a seat in the year 2000. Actually, there was a lawsuit from the state claiming that the Census Bureau did not count missionaries overseas in Utah's population estimates, and the state argued if they had done that, they would have gotten that 4th seat in Congress. They didn't win that argument, but then 10 years later in 2010, they added the 4th seat where the state sits at now. Utah came very close to adding another seat just 4 years ago when the census showed that Utah was the fastest growing state in the union. Population growth was 18.4% between 2010 and 2020, very close to giving Utah another seat in Congress, but the state fell just short. But it looks like if these current trends continue, they will be adding a 5th seat in 2030, and you can expect that the battle over redistricting in 2030 will probably be quite intense. How can we miss you if you won't go away? Utah's political Don Quixote, Phil Lyman, suffered yet another loss in his bizarre quest to somehow undo his loss in the Republican primary to Spencer Cox. Last week, Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch denied Lyman's request for an emergency injunction in his case that sought to prevent Spencer Cox from being certified as the winner of the November election. That order was issued without comment. Now Lyman has 0 legal avenues left to stop Cox from being sworn in for a second term as governor next month. You remember Lyman ran as a write-in candidate in November's election. He finished in third place, got about 13% of the vote. Lyman has been trying to sow doubt, raise questions about the legitimacy of Cox's candidacy. A couple of weeks before the election, he started raising questions about whether or not Cox had legitimately qualified for the primary election ballot through gathering signatures. He and his allies submitted a rash of open records requests trying to get access to Spencer Cox's signature packets. Those requests were denied. He sued the state to try to force them to turn it over. A judge said, no, that's not possible. He didn't stop there, though. Lyman then tried to leverage his position as an elected official, he's in the House of Representatives, to gain access to election data that state law specifically says is off limits. Of course, those efforts were rebuffed. He wasn't able to get his hands on that. Lyman twisted those results to falsely claim that the audit showed that Cox did not submit enough valid signatures to qualify for the ballot. That's not true at all. The audit did not make any determination about whether Cox had submitted the required signatures, but said that he would have had plenty of time to gather more before the deadline if he had fallen short. And then in October, Lyman asked his Republican colleagues in the legislature to convene an emergency session to try to force Cox off the November ballot because he was claiming that Cox's win in the primary election was illegitimate. After all of those efforts failed to bear fruit, and because he probably doesn't know when to quit, Lyman goes to the Utah Supreme Court and he asks the justices to kick Cox and Lieutenant Governor Deidre Henderson out of office for malfeasance, kick them off the ballot, and completely upend the state's election system. The court rejected that challenge, and so then he appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. That appeal is still pending. Lyman's argument to the Supreme Court hinges on the supposition that the Utah Republican Party's internal rules should override state election law. He claims that SB 54, which is the 2014 law that made it so candidates could gather signatures to get on the ballot, violates the First Amendment rights of political parties to choose their nominees. Lyman argues that since he won enough of the delegate vote at the state GOP convention to win the party nomination, he should not have been forced into a primary with Cox, who collected signatures. As precedent, he cites the court's 2008 decision in New York State Board of Elections versus Lopez Torres. That case challenged New York's use of the convention system to nominate judicial candidates. The plaintiff in that case argued that the system violated the First Amendment because it made it too difficult for candidates who were not favored by party leadership. Now, in that decision, the court said that yes, political parties have a First Amendment right to use their own process for nominating candidates, but states have wide latitude in regulating the election process, and that political parties can be forced to comply with state laws. So I'm not quite sure what Lyman is arguing, because that decision by the Supreme Court says state laws can trump party rules when it comes to putting candidates on the ballot. Both Governor Cox and Lieutenant Governor Henderson, who were named as defendants in the case, waived their rights to file a response to his complaint. Lyman's supporters seized on that, saying, oh, they must be guilty because they didn't file a response. No, actually what happened was they didn't deem Lyman's complaint worthy of a response, so they didn't want to waste the time. The justices are scheduled to consider Lyman's appeal on January 10th in their conference. That's when they meet and decide which cases they're going to take up and which ones they're going to reject. It's highly unlikely the court will agree to take Lyman's case. Of the thousands of cases filed every year, the court takes only about 1% of those. But let's play pretend. Let's hypothetically say that the justices do agree to take his case. What does Lyman want to have happen? In October, Lyman told his volunteers during a video call that he'd love to see the higher court kick it back down to the state Supreme Court to reconsider their decision, or maybe force a new election. The odds of the justices ordering either of those are extremely remote. But Lyman's not going to go away. He recently told his supporters that he intends to run for governor again in 4 years in 2028. Utah's top state leaders are threatening Salt Lake City to clean up the homeless problem, and they're giving them a month to do that. The Salt Lake Tribune reported that Utah Governor Spencer Cox, House Speaker Mike Schultz, and Senate President Stuart Adams sent a letter to Salt Lake City Mayor Aaron Mendenhall regarding the city's handling of homelessness and public safety issues. In that letter, they criticized the ineffectiveness of the Salt Lake City Police Department, and they demanded that they come up with a more robust safety plan by January 17th, 2025. The letter urges Mayor Mendenhall to focus on the, quote, disorder in the city, and that means focusing on laws and ordinances related to homelessness and crime. The letter threatened to increase the state's oversight and involvement of how the city addresses the homeless problem if they don't make progress on that. Mendenhall responded by acknowledging their frustration, but she emphasized the need for a long-term commitment and partnerships to address what is pretty much a complex issue of homelessness. Salt Lake City Police Chief Mike Brown defended his department's efforts while recognizing more needs to be done. This puts a spotlight on the tensions between the state government and the city when it comes to homelessness. State officials say they want more aggressive enforcement of the laws that are already in place, while the city says they need help and a partnership to come up with more comprehensive long-term solutions. And then you couple that with the reluctance of other cities around Salt Lake City to address homelessness. A couple of weeks ago, there was that story of a church in Fruit Heights that wanted to open its doors as an emergency warming shelter for unhoused people, and the community pushed back against that and they had to withdraw. They're still looking for some place as an emergency warming shelter when the temperature drops for people who have nowhere else to go to warm up, and they're still fighting over that. So you can see why the state is getting involved here. But if other cities are unwilling to shoulder their share of the load when it comes to homelessness, it's going to be very hard to come up with a solution. In last week's show, we talked about how lawmakers are taking aim at Utah's universal vote by mail system. There was a legislative audit that showed 1,400 people who were deceased were still on Utah's voter rolls. 700 of them were still classified as active, and 2 allegedly dead people voted in the 2023 election. And because of that, it seems like the legislature is getting ready to really come after the state's universal vote by mail system. Governor Spencer Cox said that he would not support an effort to do away with universal vote by mail. And that makes sense because he helped put it in place when he was the lieutenant governor. But he said he would support legislation to improve the process. There are a number of bills that have already been proposed to make changes, some large, some small. One would make it so you would have to opt into the system instead of getting a ballot mailed to you automatically. Another one would limit the people who automatically get a ballot to those who have cast a ballot in either the last 2 or last 4 elections. So it sounds like Cox is open to making some changes, but not doing away with the system entirely. And I'm sure that's good news to a lot of Utahns because the state's universal vote by mail seems to be quite popular. People like the convenience. They like not having to go to the polls on election day, take time off work. They can just fill out the ballot at the kitchen table. The legal challenge to Utah's private school vouchers program, known as the Utah Fits All Scholarship Program, had its day in court this week. The Utah Education Association, state's largest teachers union, filed suit against the program, which allows parents to take money that's supposed to go to public schools and use it to pay for private school tuition or homeschooling or any number of costs with very little oversight on where that money is going. The lawsuit filed by the UEA challenges the constitutionality of the program. They claim that Utah's constitution has a guarantee for funding for public school. The state constitution says that income tax revenues can only be used to pay for public education, higher education, and some social services. The UEA's lawsuit says that you cannot take money that's supposed to go to public education and let parents use it for private education. Lawmakers passed this in 2023. They initially funded it with $42.5 million, and then they added an additional $40 million last year. The program gives eligible students $8,000, and parents can use it for private school tuition, homeschooling, any number of expenses. That $8,000 is almost double what the state spends on each student in public education. It's called the WPU, the Weighted Pupil Unit, and that is the amount per student that the state spends, which is just a little bit over $4,000. This program gives parents $8,000 per kid. The arguments center around two key points. In 2020, voters approved Amendment G to the state constitution, which opened up what income tax money can be used for. It was only public and higher education, but Amendment G added that the money could be used to, quote, support children and to support individuals with a disability. The state is arguing that Amendment G's language allows for this scholarship program to exist because it says that you can use income tax money to support children. That's now in the Constitution. And they're saying that this private school voucher program supports children, so it's allowed. But the UEA says that it was meant for social services and not private school vouchers. Now, the judge, Laura Scott, asked several questions to both sides about whether the state's interpretation of Amendment G could lead to the creation of a parallel or a shadow education system that takes public money and funnels it to private schools. A lot of the questioning revolved around whether Amendment G allowed for the creation of that. Judge said that she will probably issue a ruling on this sometime in January. She has up to 60 days, but she said it wouldn't take that long. So that decision could be coming down right around the time that the 2025 legislative session gets underway. And that could be fascinating because lawmakers are already extremely angry at the UEA because they came out against Amendment A this year, which would have opened up that constitutional earmark even more, allowing income tax revenues to be used for pretty much anything in the budget, not just those specific things that are already spelled out. The UEA opposed that measure, and then they went to court to get it thrown off the ballot. So lawmakers are already very angry about that, and they're upset about this lawsuit over the private school vouchers program. And if a judge rules in favor of the UEA, that's going to make lawmakers extra angry. There are already expectations that they are going to be punishing UEA when the session gets underway, and this will just add more fuel to that fire. The Wall Street Journal had an incredible story this week about how models with long hair and beards are in high demand in Utah because people want models who look like Jesus. People in the state are hiring Jesus lookalikes for family portraits, wedding announcements, engagement photos. In the story, they interview Bob Sagers. He tells the story about how when he was walking around a music festival in Salt Lake City, someone came up to him and asked for his phone number and said, "Hey, has anyone ever told you that you look like Jesus?" And that's when he began his side hustle as a stand-in for Jesus in these photos. He says that since he was recruited about 4 years ago, he's posed as Jesus nearly a dozen times. And you may be asking, what's the going rate for a Jesus stand-in? Well, apparently it's between $100 and $200 an hour. Some of the models in the story said that it's kind of a tough job because the people who hire them not only want them to look like Jesus, but they want them to embody Jesus. One person said that he was hired as a Jesus stand-in, and the person who hired them wanted them to be, quote, the most Christ-like person you can be, or people will be able to tell through the photos that it's not real. The story ends with this. There's a model who is posing for photos in the Salt Flats when a woman who was not part of the group comes up to him and asks if he could walk with her for a moment while holding her hand. And he replied to her and said, I'm not the real Jesus. And she told him that she had been looking for a sign from God when she was driving by and saw Jesus taking photos with people and figured that was it. Joining me now on the show is Jackson Lewis. At 19 years old, he's believed to be the youngest elected official in Utah history. He was just elected to the Canyon School Board, and I'm really excited to chat with him today. Jackson, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me. It's exciting to be here.
I'm really curious, what prompted you to run? You were a high school senior last year.
Mm-hmm.
What prompted you to throw your hat in the ring?
So, I mean, it's a story I've told quite a bit. It's the story of I was in my UCAW week, Utah College and Career Awareness Ready week, and we were in my English classroom, and I just heard my teacher as well as some members of the college and career readiness staff just cracking jokes about the state legislature, about how they're kind of feeling overwhelmed with the mandates and all that, and how the board, they just need some more help from canyons, right? From the district themselves. So I looked up who my board member was. I looked up the rules for running. It was 2022. The election wasn't until 2024, and I was 17 anyway. So I kind of put it aside for a while. And then earlier last year, 2023, I got a job working up at the state legislature for the Office of Legislative Research and General Counsel. And it kind of fell into the right place at the right time. So I filed to run at the beginning of this year because I wanted to I've lived in Midvale my whole life. I love this city and this town, right? I wouldn't willingly choose to represent any other place, right? I love Midvale. It was just, things fell into the right place at the right time. And if I've always been passionate about education and politics, right? I mean, I was a product of public education. I graduated from Hillcrest in 2023. So it's always been public education. So I was just happy things fell in the right place and I was able to serve.
Obviously, you had some things that you wanted to do. And this is one thing I like to ask candidates. I'm like, what do you want to do if you get into office? I mean, there are people who run for office, they have policy agendas, they have things they want to accomplish. What is it that you want to accomplish on the local level once you take office in January?
So the big thing I've talked about throughout my campaign is protecting student pedestrians. I know there's going to be conversations that are going to be had with moving the safe walking routes. I know I've told stories of told horror stories of students I've watched walk home from Union as I'm driving on 9th and 7th East, walking home from Union, and they almost get hit by cars right next to Hillcrest, right? And they're on the safe walking route, right? Those walking routes need to be moved onto pedestrian roads away from arterial roads that have 50 mile an hour speed limits. And that's something that I'm very much looking forward to working with the other board members to achieving, because student safety is an absolute priority, as well as fighting chronic absenteeism. I've had quite a few meetings already as I'm preparing to take office. We've talked about kind of what the district wants, what the data looks like on absenteeism, what other districts are looking at, what we can be looking at. I mean, with our new eBay facility, we are looking at we're so excited about the eBay facility and what it can do for our students, right? And we really do think it can help us get kids excited for school again, which is a big part of what I think we need to be doing to get kids excited and back into school again. That's the big root of chronic absenteeism, at least for the way I experienced chronic absenteeism, the way people around me experience chronic absenteeism in high school. Just those kinds of things, as well as just adding my young person perspective to the board. As I mentioned, we have this eBay facility, a bunch of those decisions coming up, right? And having a perspective of someone who went through the school system post-COVID, and even a little bit pre-COVID, right? Having that perspective on the board, making decisions that will be impacting education for the next 20, 30, 40 years. I think that's something I'm really excited to provide.
I know you're going to be biased with this answer, but it seems to me that your perspective as someone who was recently in the public school system, you have a very recent experience. That is a voice that I guess has been absent from a lot of these discussions, because you can talk about it from the perspective of a student who knows what life was like as recently as a couple of years ago. I mean, it's been decades since I've been in public school, and my experience is not analogous to anything that happens today. So, I mean, talk about how you plan to bring that perspective to these discussions, and and how valuable it is to you being someone who was elected to be there. So your voice has to be a part of this discussion, rather than people wringing their hands saying, "What do the young people want?"
Yeah, I mean, that's totally true. I mean, I know there's a big discussion happening right now, just nationwide, about how to engage young people in terms of politics and obviously in terms of education, right? So, I myself, as a young person, right, when bringing a perspective to a school board, I know all of the other board members, right? They are PTA moms, they're teachers, they're everyone that typically makes up a school board, right? And that's great. I'm so incredibly grateful that I have such an amazing support system on this board already. But yeah, do you know what? I've watched conversations had on the board throughout my campaign. Even I've watched conversations happen at the legislative level, that it is just extremely abundantly clear that young folks were left out of the conversation. In terms of a big issue that the state of Utah is facing right now is housing, right? And obviously that's not something that the school board has a direct impact on, right? But the conversations we're having at the district, we're having issues with declining enrollment, and that's not just a Canyons issue, it's a statewide issue. Our population is aging. We need younger folks in our schools, right? So a part of that conversation, and I'm not sure it's a conversation being had on the Hill because it's full of developers and older folks, is we need more access to broader types of housing, types of the United States just doesn't have middle housing. We have low density and high density, and it's, that's a big conversation that's being had in urbanist squares, right? But that's a conversation, that a perspective that a young person can bring to a group of people in power, right? Another issue specifically related to education is, smartphones in class. I was a kid that had a smartphone in class from 7th grade and up. I got my first phone in 7th grade. This is a very complicated, subject. I would have hated to have had my phone taken away from me during class. There is, to speak to this school shooting that happened in Madison this last week, I felt an enormous amount of comfort year over year over year with the ability to be able to access my parents through my phone. And when we have,
and that goes both ways. I mean, I've talked to parents who said, I need.
Yes.
I mean, it's sort of a larger two-way anxiety. Children
Yes.
feel comfort that they can access their parents at any moment, and parents feel comfort that they can access their children at any moment.
Right.
And there's an anxiety when you've had that, when people are saying, "Well, we need to stop that because of this and this and this."
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, yeah, if my parents were here doing this interview with me, right, they would say the exact same thing. We were so grateful to have access to our kids while they were in class, right? And I would hate for any large universal blanket rule being handed out by the legislature that would take away the teachers' rights to choose what's going on in their classroom, take away the parents' rights to choose what they're doing with their kids, and takes away the students' rights to feel secure in connection with other people, right? So ultimately, I mean, when conversations like that come around, when the governor is pushing for stuff, the legislature is pushing for stuff, I think there's something really valuable to be had, a voice in a position of power that they can't really just steamroll, because I'm not just some leader of some special interest group, right? I'm an elected official with a vote on a board, right? I think there's something to be gained in the public discourse and just the decision-making process broadly, and having a voice that's so directly connected to students, right?
And you bring up a great point, because when I've covered legislative hearings, when I've covered legislative meetings, and a young person testifies, they usually have some connection to an activist group that wants something. I think about the social media bans that they were passing, and there was a young lady who got up and spoke rather eloquently about the need about the dangers of social media. But she was the daughter of Corinne Johnson, who was the head of Utah Parents United, who had just also spoken on that. So when you're hearing these younger voices, they usually are part of a larger agenda. Now, I'm
Yeah.
sure everybody would have an agenda talking about
hmm
it, but you bring something else to the table as an elected official, and that's as I think about it, as someone who has been an observer of these, it's hard to dismiss you as as someone who's put up to it by your parents, or or part of an activist group, because you as you said, you are an elected official and you have a vote, and there's some weight behind what you are saying now.
Right. And do you know what? That's absolutely so true. Like, uh, yeah, that's actually absolutely right. I'm not put here by my parents. I'm not put here by any other organization, right? I represent the constituents of my district. I represent the people of Midvale and Northern Sandy on this board, and that's the only people I represent. So when I go and I'm advocating for a policy or advocating against a policy change or wherever I'm speaking, right, my only interest is Midvale and Northern Sandy, right? I'm not pushing some agenda from some national group or some whatever, right? My interest is canyons, and my special interest is canyons, and my special interest is the people that I represent, right? So I think there is absolutely something to be gained with a young person's voice. There's clearly some clarity behind it, and not some corruption and,
Yeah.
Just special dealing behind it. I absolutely, yeah, that's something I find very valuable. And I hope, because I've had conversations, just to go on a little bit of a tangent, right? I've had conversations with my friends, with other young people who've reached out to me since I've won my election. And one, I've never heard so many young folks talk about running for office before. Like, my friends who have never been interested in politics before are like, oh, I should snatch up a local city council seat. Like, that would be, I'm inspired now, right, is what they've told me. And that is something that is so unbelievably important. Utah is the youngest state in the country on average, and it's something I've talked about on my campaign extensively. Young people in Utah need to be involved in politics, because even if you're not interested in politics, politics is interested in you. So it's time to get involved and run for things and make sure your voice is heard, right? It's time for that.
I say that all the time. If you're not interested in politics, politics is going to take an interest in you. And if you can tell, I am fascinated about this dynamic that's going to happen with someone who obviously has a much different perspective than everyone else on the board. But I want to use that to ask this: how were you received on the campaign trail? When you went out door knocking, when you went out trying to convince people to vote for you, you've got a 19-year-old, and this is not meant as a pejorative, but you've got a 19-year-old kid saying, "Hey, I'm running for Canyon School Board,"
Yeah.
and my first reaction would be, "Where's the camera?" Because I want to. So I'm curious how you were received on the trail.
So that is actually a great question, because it's actually something that I was obviously nervous about when I filed to run, right?
Oh,
And
clearly, you're not
right,
nervous about this.
yeah, right. So as soon as I started going, I actually started in my neighborhood. I love my neighborhood, right? It's the reason I ran, right? I love Midvale. So when I started going out, there was conversations I would have with people that immediately I could tell they're weirded out by a 19-year-old running for office, right? When I go up to people, typically they're like, "Oh, what candidate are you campaigning for?" Like, whatever, right? And then I tell them, "Oh, I'm running for school board," and they almost every single time I get a weird look, and I've gotten to the point it doesn't hurt my feelings, whatever, right? That's how it goes. And then, but it's interesting. Almost every single time I give them my campaign, what I had, my campaign literature, and we would talk specifically about chronic absenteeism. That's something that I made a big connection with a lot of voters on the campaign trail. And as soon as I would mention that issue and talk about my connection to it, and how I want to address it, I could see the look on their face, the concern, the almost shut out of, oh, he's really young, he shouldn't be in politics. I could see it melt off their face, and it happened dozens, hundreds of times even throughout the entire campaign trail. And that's something that, I mean, it's a lesson that I'm going to be taking away from it for the rest of my life. Even if people look at you and don't take you immediately seriously, know what you're talking about and then talk about it, and then they'll take you seriously. You need to present yourself in a serious way, and then folks will take you seriously, especially as a young person. I've spoken to quite a few young candidates. I mean, I've been reached out to by young candidates in Utah that are planning on running for future office and across the country. It's the weirdest feeling. But yeah, that's the advice I give every time, is to humanize yourself and to make yourself appear informed and well-spoken. And 9 times out of 10, the concern about you being young will melt away, and you can watch it happen on their faces.
That is a fascinating dynamic, but it makes sense, you know. I mean, you hear people when you get the impression that someone is competent in a subject, or in many cases just pretending they're competent in a subject, people will tend to listen to you,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a big advantage. I read an op-ed that you authored at the end of the last legislative session, where you took the legislature to task for a number of issues. You talked about education funding. You talked about chronic absenteeism in this. It was quite a well-written op-ed in the Salt Lake Tribune. Talk a little bit about how you envision engaging with lawmakers who are going to be making a lot of the decisions that will be, coming down for you, that will impact how you do your job as an elected official. This could be a particularly rough legislative session
Yeah.
for education.
Yeah.
Republicans on the Hill are very angry at the Utah Education Association over the failure of Amendment A, getting it knocked off the ballot, the lawsuit over the school vouchers program, which is in court today as we are recording this on a Thursday. How do you plan on engaging with lawmakers? Obviously, you know, most of the lawmakers in Salt Lake County, or the largest number, all of the Democrats in the legislature are from Salt Lake
Mm-hmm.
County, so you won't have a hard time getting in touch with them. But how do you talk to Republicans who may be a little bit more hostile to education, and then add on top of that someone who's 19 years old and just elected to office? How do you plan on engaging with them?
So, do you know what? That is actually a spectacular question. So, during my last couple of weeks, I've been attending meetings at the district, onboarding. We had a whole bunch of meetings just about canyons. And it's not just for myself and the other new board member, right? It's also for local elected officials, like citywide state legislators, right? And I've had conversations with state legislators. What we need to remember as people generally is that these folks in the legislature are also people and can be reached in the same way that other people can be. Like, I worked for the legislature earlier this year, right? I know I know to a degree of quite a few of these people on the Hill. Yeah, it's not going to be an easy task to get them to, support public education. But do you know what? I know there are a lot of people up there on the Hill that do support public education, even if they have an R next to their name. Public education is, it's a priority for a lot of folks. And in terms of engaging them, as a young person who just came out of the education system and is now on the board of Canyons, one of the bigger districts in the state, right? I would just hope that they would listen, because I've had conversations with other board members, right? It's complicated. The relationship is complicated. I know Canyons has a really good relationship with our legislators, and I'm extremely, extremely grateful for that. I know kind of what we have going on this year, what the Canyons plan is with our state legislators, and I'm hoping for positive moves in the right direction, right? We have good priorities, we have good alliances with our state legislators, Yeah.
that is a great answer. And I look forward to seeing how that plays out. Last thing I want to ask you, and this is just going back to a theme that we've talked about throughout this interview. I've noticed that Utahns just don't get involved in the process. You are someone who got involved in the process, and it paid off for you. A lot of people they have lives, they have things other things they're doing, they have jobs, they're busy, they can't be bothered to get involved in politics at any level, policy decisions, discussions at any level. But the groups that do engage, for the most part, are much fringier. They are they're fringier. There's not a lot of them, but they are loud and they are organized, and that gets them in the door. And then what happens is they get what they want, and then they go a little bit further. Utah Parents United, who started off as a group that was pushing back against mask mandates in schools, that ended. They got some influence through that. Then they pushed the voucher program, the Utah Fits All Scholarship. And now this session, they're targeting fluoride in the water, which is just keep pushing one step more. Even if it's not as running for a candidate, talk about, because you're going to be an elected official now, hearing from your constituents, hearing from the public on an issue, and how that's going to shape your decision-making process. And hopefully, people will understand that if they talk to their elected officials, it goes a lot further than an email or a letter or something. You got to get up there and talk to them face to face if you can.
Right. So yeah, one of the lessons I learned working up at the legislature earlier this year is that because I was a session secretary, I staffed committee meetings. I was there when people would come in and testify, right? So I learned that when people show up, if you're well-spoken and you're not like combative with the members of the committee, right? Generally, they will leave remembering what you said. So as someone who's going to be sitting up on a dais myself in the next month, I know that if people that show up to meetings and say what they are feeling, they're going to be heard. So please show up to the meetings. You don't have to run for office, right? Not everyone has to run for office. If we had 300 million Americans running for office, what's that getting done, right? What you can do is show up to city council meetings, school board meetings, legislative committee meetings, and share your opinion, share your lived experience that could be impacted by the decision they're making there. Because do you know what? No good decision can be made if the people whose the decision is going to be affecting, if their opinions and their insights are not taken into account. Otherwise, the decision's going to be bad. Because obviously, right? So please show up to local government meetings, show up to your city planning meeting. Like another dynamic, when cities are discussing new housing projects that are going to bring down the cost of living, a lot of times neighbors will show up and oppose these new developments, and the planning commission will deny the moving forward of the development, right? It's because nobody shows up and speaks in favor of that thing, right? So please show up and speak in favor of what is good, because if it's a room full of people who are speaking in favor of things that aren't great, the board and the people making the decisions are going to think that that's the only opinion that's out there. So please be present. Make sure that your perspective is in front of people and that you're seen, because otherwise the decisions will ignore you and steamroll you. Make sure you're seen. You don't even have to run for office to do that.
He is Jackson Lewis. He is a newly elected member of the Canyon School Board. He is the youngest elected official in Utah history, as far as I can tell, and I've looked. Jackson, this has been an absolute delight. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
If It's no secret that the Utah Legislature has become increasingly hostile to the media in recent years. A couple of years ago, they banned reporters and cameras from the House and Senate chambers. You had to stay up in the gallery. You couldn't be in the hallways. They put restrictions on where we could stand and sit during committee hearings, which is just an attempt to control the narrative of what happens in the legislature. And by banning us from some of those areas, it also insulates and protects lawmakers from facing questions from journalists outside of approved settings or tightly controlled settings. And this week I went one step further as the legislature refused to give me a credential to cover the 2025 legislative session. I've covered the legislature for 25 years. My first year on the Hill was 1999. I've been there every single year. I've been given a credential every year since they started the program. But this year they said they were not going to give me a credential, and I'm going to explain what they said and why it feels like this was targeted specifically at me, and it's possibly retribution for me writing critical stories about the current leadership up on the Hill. The process for getting a press badge is usually a formality. Applicants have to pass a background check by the Highway Patrol, and then you have someone in the Utah House or Senate sign off on the application. I trekked up to Capitol Hill on Tuesday to go through the process. That was the first day they were issuing press badges. I easily passed the background check. It showed there were no open warrants. I had no criminal activity. So I took that form to Alexa Musselman, who is the communications director for the House. Usually, it's a 5-second process where they take the form, they initial it, and send you on your way. But she told me that because Utah Political Watch was a new organization, giving me a press credential was going to require a little more scrutiny. She told me that they had to look my application over for a bit, and she had to touch base with other people. Now, that's very unusual. I've never heard of that happening before. Usually, if you're with a legitimate media outlet, they just sign your form and that's that. But I expected this to happen, and I'll explain why in a second. I asked her if they applied the same level of scrutiny to Utah News Dispatch, which is an outlet that just started publishing at the end of 2023. They do some great work. I really enjoy reading their stuff. They've got some good reporters over there. Now, Utah News Dispatch only started publishing in late November of 2023. That was about a month before the 2024 session, and they got, by my count, at least 4 credentials issued to them. I asked if there was the same hesitancy to issue them a press credential, and Musselman just said, we did have some conversations with them, and that was it. I asked her how long it was going to take to talk it over. She said about an hour, so I told her that I would wait, because I got the feeling that they wanted me to go away, and then they were going to tell me later. And after about 90 minutes of sitting outside the office, I finally get an email that said, we're not going to give you a media credential. The reason given was Utah Capitol media credentials are currently not issued to blogs, independent, or other freelance journalists. I can't say I was surprised that this happened, because I noticed that the policy for approving these credentials, the policy surrounding credentials, was quietly revised late last month. And that revision came after I had reached out about adding Utah Political Watch to their press release distribution list and the process for applying for a 2025 press badge. I sent that email on November 5th, and when I downloaded the revised policy surrounding media credentials, the metadata said that the document was created on November 24th. I have asked them for a copy of the previous policy. They have not responded. I asked them to define blog or independent media. They've also ignored those emails, which is pretty typical. I have to tell you, I've never heard of an organization that actually does journalism being denied a press credential before. And I have a sneaky suspicion that this denial is retribution for some critical stories I've written in the past, and one that I wrote last week that I told you about. A recent story I wrote was about some complaints filed over Senate President Stuart Adams' campaign spending disclosures. And when I published that, Andrea Peterson, who is the deputy chief of staff in the Utah Senate, she went ballistic. She started texting me, demanding changes to the story, attacking my journalistic ethics. One text from her said, quote, "As someone who claims to be a journalist, it's disappointing to see such a lack of professionalism. Your story is not only misleading, it's factually inaccurate." There was a factual inaccuracy, but it wasn't my story. It was Peterson's text. Because as I told you last week, I asked for emails between President Adams and the Lieutenant Governor's office over his campaign finance filings because he made a social media post that was very insulting towards me, attacking my integrity, attacking my journalism, claiming that my story was misleading, and claiming that he was told that his filing was A-OK. And that, like the texts I got from Peterson, just wasn't the truth. And it's really hard not to look at that reaction to my story and some of the other reactions I've gotten throughout the years, criticism I've gotten throughout the years from members of the staff in both the House and the Senate and from legislative leaders themselves. It's really hard not to think that this denial of my press credential was not retaliation for that reporting that I've done in the past. I have appealed, and I've posted the text of that appeal to my social media channels. And if you want to go read it, you can head over there. But in short, I basically explained that I've been a working journalist reporting on the legislature for 25 years. I've been credentialed every year since they put this into place. I have a large audience for my work that does not depend on who I work for, which seems to be the criteria for denying my credential because they said independent media is not eligible, which means that the only people who are eligible to get one of these work for KSL or the Salt Lake Tribune or Deseret News or whatever, and anybody else is just out of luck. I pointed out that the journalism I do is relevant. It's impactful. For instance, you may remember that on election night, I had an interview with Senator-elect John Curtis shortly after he was declared the winner of the election. And another example of how relevant my journalism is President Adams' reaction to my story that I published last week. If he wasn't paying attention to it, if he didn't think that my journalism made an impact, he would have ignored it. But no, he posted several paragraphs on his social media channels attacking me over this story. I'm not optimistic that my appeal is going to be given a fair shake, that I'm going to get a fair hearing, because the people who are in charge of the appeal are the same people who denied my request in the first place, and they work for the legislature, and so they're hardly unbiased in this. So I have no confidence that they're going to grant my appeal. And if they don't, I'll have to consider other options. This whole thing just highlights the danger of allowing the Utah Legislature to decide who is a legitimate journalist and who is not a legitimate journalist. For years, I've been advocating to form a Capitol Hill Press Association to create a level of insulation between the legislature and reporters. I think that it is wholly appropriate for journalists as a group to say these are the journalists who should be credentialed for the session. These are the journalists who should be given press passes. And if you object to any of them, then you need to tell us why. You need to explain why. They do that in other states. Colorado has a very robust press association. I know they have one in Wisconsin and Iowa, and I think we should have one here because these are public officials. They work for the people. And when they're trying to decide who can and cannot report on them, you have to wonder what they've got to hide. It just leaves a really bad taste in my mouth. Denying me a press credential does not mean that I can't cover the legislature, but it does put some restrictions on the things that I'm allowed to do. I will not be able to attend any press conferences. President Adams has a daily media availability, which most of the time is useless because nobody says anything, but it's good to be in the room to be able to ask questions and get people on the record. I won't be able to go to that. House Speaker Mike Schultz, he has press availabilities from time to time. I will be shut out of those and not able to attend. If they have a press briefing on a bill or an initiative, I won't be able to go to those. And so then all of a sudden I am relying on other media to get information that I should be able to get myself in person. I'm not able to attend Governor Spencer Cox's televised press conference. That's up at KUED. It's supposed to be every month, but it may be every other month. I won't be able to attend that or other media availabilities that are up at the Capitol because I won't have a press credential. It severely limits my access to information and my access to elected officials and keeps me from asking them questions, which you got to think is kind of the reason why they denied me a press credential. And you have to come to the conclusion that they're afraid of me. They're afraid of the questions that I ask. They're afraid of the stories that I write, and they want to punish me and keep me out. It's really hard to come up with any other conclusion than that. So I never thought I would become the most feared journalist in Utah, but I guess I am. And I'm going to do my damnedest to live up to that. And that does it for this week. No show next week because of Christmas. I hope you all have a safe and happy holiday. Remember to rate and review this podcast at iTunes, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. That helps new listeners find the show. Everything is driven by the algorithm these days, and if the algorithm sees that people are rating and reviewing the show, then it will suggest it to more people. So we're slaves to the algorithm, and I would really appreciate the help. If there is a topic you'd like me to tackle or a guest you want me to hear on the show, reach out, let me know. You can email me or find me on Threads, Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, everywhere except for Elon Musk's hell site. Sign up for my newsletter. It's utahpoliticalwatch.news. You can sign up for free or become a paying subscriber to support my work. It'll make me able to produce more podcasts like this, and it will help me commit more acts of journalism. Special Session with Brian Schott is written and produced by me, Brian Schott. Thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you soon.